All right. It looks out, as you look out this window, it looks like the sun's coming out finally. Welcome to our rainy Florida weather, our typical Wednesday storm. So glad to have you all here Wednesday night, and what encouragement it is to have you all here. We have some visitors with us tonight, so if you haven't introduced yourself yet, please do so after class, after services, and want to make them feel very, very welcome. All right, so we are in lesson 2 of our topical study about the culture of the New Testament. What it was like to be a Christian in the first century in that Greco-Roman world. And so you might remember that last week we talked about the idea of status and how status was everything. And it wasn't enough to have status, you had to display that status. And ultimately what we were after is to, one of the things that we want to accomplish in this class is not only to get a really good background of what the culture was like that the New Testament was written in, to help us understand kind of what we're reading, the historical context, but as well the challenge of what it would be like to be a Christian in that day, in that time, and in that culture, and ultimately then look at it from our standpoint, the challenges of us being a Christian in our day and in our culture. How does it relate? Sometimes it's going to be very different. Sometimes it's going to be very much the same. But when it comes to status, what we learn is that whether you're talking about that time or our time, when you become a Christian, you can't pursue status and look at status the same way that the world does. You've got to change your pursuit. You've got to change your perspective of status. You've got to look at it as God looks at it. And we looked at several passages in that regard. We talked about where Jesus taught the first shall be last, the last shall be first. That's very different. The great leader will be the servant. If you want to be great, you have to become like a little child. These are all things that would not be taught in the culture of that day. And so hopefully you're enjoying that perspective as we compare our culture to theirs. So again, something very important in those days was honor, to have honor. So what we need to understand is honor is not exactly the same as status, okay? So you can have status, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have honor. And you can have honor, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have any type of status. Now, sometimes you have both, but you can't have honor without status. You can't have honor without wealth and riches, okay? So today, when we think of someone with high status as having honor, but it really wasn't that way in the ancient world. So a lot of times when we think about people with status, not always, but a lot of times people with high status, a majority of people would think, oh, they have honor. We need to grant them honor of some sort. But in the ancient world, it wasn't that same way. These were two different concepts. So honor is the respect and approval of your group. And you might be saying, group? What do you mean group? What kind of group? Well, we're going to talk about that in just a moment. So you can have honor even if you don't have status, and that's what we talked about. All right. So honor is defined by the group. So as you live in that culture, just like today, you're going to be involved in several different groups. And each group is going to have, or each group is going to determine what honor is, how you achieve that honor, who gets honor in that particular group, and it's going to be different in each group. So some of the groups that you are part of in that culture is obviously you are part of society as a whole, right? You are part of that Greco-Roman world that includes all the different people, all the different cultures of your particular location, right? And so in that society, there is a determination of how you get honor, who gets the honor, and so forth. You're also part of a national culture, and we're going to talk about that. So if you're a Roman, well, you're going to be very, very interested in gaining honor from the Romans, from the Roman culture. You're going to want to achieve that, and of course, the Romans are going to have a certain way that you can achieve that honor. If you're a Greek, that's going to be a little bit different. You're not going to be so much concerned. Well, you might be a little concerned because you still are being ruled by the Romans, but you are a Greek. You're part of that culture, that influence. And one of the groups we're going to be talking about is a Jew. If you're a Jew, well, that group is going to look at honor very differently than a Roman or a Greek. All right? So you have a national culture that's kind of a smaller group within society as whole. Where you work might be a group. Even if you're a farmer, there could be a group within that farming community that you're part of, and you can gain honor through that. Family, that's another group. And then, of course, in our purposes, as you become a Christian, you're part of a very important group that others are not, and that is the church. And so how do you get honor in the church? How do you achieve that? How is it granted? And of course, as you look at this, hopefully you can say, oh, I get what you're saying. We're going to look at honor and achieving honor very differently in the church than we do if you're a Roman or a Greek or even a Jew, right? So just like you have to look at it differently when it comes to status, you're going to have a different perspective of honor when it comes to the church. And if you don't, well, that could cause all sorts of problems for that group and for yourself. So this is what I'm talking about, these different groups, and each group has kind of a different way of gaining honor or who gets that honor. And so each group has its own set of rules, and most of these are what we would say kind of unwritten rules, right? So let's pause here for a second and just kind of look at our own culture. Would you say our culture is kind of similar to that or different than that? You say it's different? Okay. Is there anything in particular you're thinking about where it's different? How do you gain honor in our society? Would anyone say it's kind of the same?
I think same, because it seems like you buy anything nowadays, everything's about money.
Okay.
Honor, people honor celebrities and football players.
Yeah.
Like that.
Yeah, and I think there's some similarity because, like, at work, if you're granted some type of honor at work, well, at work, that might be very important, but outside of that work, does anyone really care? Not really, right? When my boys were growing up, I was what they call the Cub Master in their Cub Scout troop, and that means I was kind of overseeing the whole pack, all the different levels of Cub Scouts, and I was in charge of the pack meeting that was once or twice a month, right? And because of that, because I took on that responsibility, there was a lot of honor in that Cub Scout group. But outside, people saw me in my Cub Scout uniform, my Cub Scout uniform, and they're like, well, I don't care. Yeah, they don't really care. And so there's some similarity to that, right? At work, depending on what your work is, there can be certain honor, even among people that are not part of that group. One of the things I enjoyed about being a firefighter is people didn't know you, but you had this uniform on, and people would just thank you. Thank you for your service. Thank you. And I'm kind of in my mind like, I didn't do anything, right? But it's really neat because as a preacher, you don't have a whole lot of honor outside of your church, right? In fact, if you're outside your church, and sometimes even inside the church, you tell people you're a preacher, and they don't want to talk to you anymore, right? So being a firefighter was very different, and it's different because you have this nice uniform with a badge, and then over here's a police officer with a nice uniform and a badge, and what? No one gets honor. A whole lot of people think that's dishonorable, but they love firefighters. So in a way, there's some similarities. There probably are some differences as well. So as we talk about honor, doing the honorable thing is always the primary motive behind personal behavior. In other words, as you are raised to always be thinking about the honorable thing to do. The honorable thing is the right thing, right? And so we're going to build on this honor system. And so imagine being in that culture, growing up in that culture, and what's being taught is that you have to behave in such a way that you're bringing honor to yourself, and as you bring honor to yourself, you're bringing honor to the group, to your family, maybe to your place of employment, maybe to your society at large, right? So at the end of this class, we'll talk a little bit about what happens when you do the dishonorable thing. But right now we're focusing on that was everything in that day. It wasn't about you and what you wanted. It was about doing the honorable thing. And that was the focus in that culture. So if you don't do the honorable thing, then what happens is you bring shame not just upon yourself, but upon your group, right? You have a rebellious son, and how do people look at that? Not just that's shameful that their son is so rebellious and sinful, but what? The parents need to be ashamed that they've raised a son like that, right? Now, I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but I'm explaining that was the honor culture. That's how they looked at things. It wasn't about what you wanted. It wasn't about, you just getting, it was about the group. And so the group is bigger than the individual. And you see that a lot in sports, right? The name on the front of the jersey is much more important than the one in the back, right? In other words, there's no I in team. And so if you as a team member make it all about yourself and wanting to get all the honor and all the glory, then what? Well, the team suffers. It's about playing together as a team. And that's kind of the idea that we have here. So you want to try to stay away from doing the dishonorable thing and bringing shame upon you and your particular group. So in New Testament times, what scholars refer to this as, they refer to this as an honor culture. And that shows you how important this is. It's about doing the honorable thing. It's not just about you, it's about the group. So in modern times, what would be a country, what would be a nation that has that same type of culture, that would have, we would say, has that honor culture? What would you say? Japan is one of those. Japan has the honor culture. Yeah. What else? China, right? China is an honor culture. And I'm thinking about one more. Islam is very much about the honor culture, right? And so it's not just in those things, in those cultures about, outside of religion. Think about when you put religion in there, right? Especially with Islam. You must do the honorable thing, and that means you do all those Islamic things, and you pray 3 times a day, and you honor Muhammad, all that. Why? Because that's the honorable thing. And if you don't, then, that you come down with severe type of shame, right? And it's interesting, you think about China, right? You talk about Eastern Europe, right? And what happened to communism in Eastern Europe? Didn't survive, right? The wall came tumbling down, and when that wall came tumbling down, it came tumbling down in all the other countries, right? But not China. And not that this is the only reason why it's lasted so long, but I think that honor culture has a lot to do with the longevity of communism, right? Now, that doesn't mean that these examples up here have the same values and you achieve honor the same way. I'm not saying that. It's not a complete parallel, but they are in their own right and in their own determination of how you come up with it. They are honor cultures. And hopefully that might put things in perspective for you a little bit. Now, let's talk a little bit, kind of put yourself into the story. Let's put yourself in, now you're a Jew. Okay, we're not going to talk about Christianity yet, but you are born into that Greco-Roman world as a Jew. So your primary thing is, I want to bring honor to Judaism, right? I want to do what is honorable to Judaism, okay? So in doing that, I'm part of a monotheistic group, right? We worship not many gods, but one God. We worship Yahweh. Now, especially among the Hellenistic Jews that go out into the world, is that going to be kind of a challenge? Because everyone else that you're living around, what are they? They're not monotheistic. Yeah, they're polytheistic, right? They got several gods that they focus on, that they worship, right? So as they look at you as a Jew and you say, oh, no, there's only one God, the true God, well, they're going to look at that as, almost like a slap in the face, or that's very strange to think there's just one God, right? Because in their culture, it's not that way. What about this? So, because I'm part of this monotheistic group, and I'm part of this law of Judaism, the law of Moses, that law tells me as a Jew, I must do the honorable thing, and to do the honorable thing is I can't worship these Greek gods. I can't worship the gods among the Gentiles that I live among. And so, that's the honorable thing as a Jew, but to the outsider, to the Greek or the Roman, to the Gentiles, that's considered to be, that's a dishonorable thing. You're living among us, and you won't worship our gods? I want you to think about that. Would that put a little bit of stress and challenge in living in that type of world, that culture? Absolutely it would, right? And in another lesson coming up, we're going to deal with this a little more in depth, because I really think we have to have a perspective of how the Gentiles looked at the Jews and even the Christians when it came to worshiping their gods. All right? So, challenge. Who will the Hellenistic Jews be loyal to, and who will they honor? Who will they seek to honor? Right? And this is really something that comes out of what we call the intertestamental period, right? Especially with these Greek rulers who tried to make and force Jews to become Greek, to live like Greeks, to eat Greek food, to dress like Greeks, and to worship the Greek gods, right? And what came out of that was this question: what does it mean to be a Jew? How much Hellenistic culture can you accept and still be a Jew and not cross that line? And you might think, like, every Jew rejected the Greek culture, the Greek influence. They said, no, we're not doing that, but that's not true. There were many Jews that embraced it and said, yes, I want to be just like the Greeks. And that came about, these Maccabean wars that we read about in the book of Maccabees. So it's all about that time. And so basically the answer came for most Jews is, yeah, you can accept a lot of the Greek influence, the Greek culture to one degree or another, but when it comes to religion, when it comes to worshiping their gods, that's where you have to say no. That's where you say no. Now, of course, that's going to be a little different for the native Hebrews than it is for the Hellenistic Jews. And we've already talked a little bit about that. So when you choose to be loyal to Judaism, then often you'll be seen as dishonoring the Greek world. And we'll see some examples of that. What about circumcision? As a Jew, as a male Jew, you're circumcised. We had no choice. Your parents did that when you were 8 days old, right? But now you have your own wife and you're having your own children, and what? You're going to circumcise those male children. Why? Because you're a Jew, and that's the honorable thing. That's what the law tells you. God says to do that. But how do the Gentiles look at that? They didn't like it at all. They saw it as barbaric, as like you're mutilating your own flesh. Different perspective, right? One says it's honorable, one says it's dishonorable. And so you can start to see the challenge that comes about living in that culture as a Jew, right? Now, I'm not saying I can make a dogmatic point on this, but it seems to have some weight to it. You think about Timothy. Timothy's mother was a Jew. His father was a Gentile, Greek, right? And it seemed like they had a deal that she could raise Timothy in the Jewish faith with one exception: circumcision. He wasn't circumcised. And that quite possibly could be because that was just, he's going, well, we're not doing that, right? We're not doing that. What about Moses? When Moses was heading back to the promised land, right? He was married to not an Israelite, but a Midianite, to Zipporah. And remember that crazy story where Moses apparently gets struck by God with some sickness, and Zipporah, to get rid of that plague, what does she do to her son? She circumcises him. And she takes the foreskin that she cut off her son, and what does she do? She throws it at Moses. You are a bridegroom of blood. To be a fly on that wall. Moses was in trouble. So there seemed to, that's some of the evidence of what we're talking about. Now I know Moses, Zipporah, that's Old Testament, but it's kind of it fits here, right? Ceremonial uncleanness. Well, especially with the Jews going out into the Hellenistic, the Greco-Roman world, right? They've been taught. This is what they've been taught. It is not lawful for a Jew to hang around Gentiles, to associate with them, even to eat with them, right? But you got to go out there and you've got to be around Gentiles somewhat, right? You got to go shopping and you got to take care of business, and you live in a Greco-Roman town. So what came about was this idea of ceremonial cleanness, how you get that uncleanness of the Gentiles off of you, right? Well, imagine you're a Jew living in their city, in their town, and you keep referring to them and wanting to stay away from them as much as you can as unclean people, right? Well, how are the Greeks going to see that? That's disrespectful, dishonorable, right? And so it just adds to that barrier wall between Jew and Gentile. That's the culture Jews lived in. So living in an honor culture made being a Jew challenging because so much of what was honorable to a Jew was dishonorable, disrespectful to the Gentiles they lived among. So, we're going to look at some passages that kind of come to mind that kind of demonstrate this. If, as we were talking, there's something in the Bible that came to you, let me know. Let me know. We'll look at that, right? That's what we want to do. We want to take what we're talking about and relate it to evidence in the Bible. So in Acts chapter 10, well, what's Acts 10? Well, we're dealing with Peter. And who is Peter talking to in Acts 10? Anyone remember? Cornelius. A Jewish man, right? No, a Roman. A Roman centurion. But notice about him, he is a believer in God and praying to God, right? So there's a part of him that has been influenced by the Jews. And so Peter needed a little help, but he finally got to the house of Cornelius. And in verse 28, this is what he said to Cornelius and his household, his friends. You yourselves know how unlawful it is for a man who is a Jew to associate with a foreigner or to visit him. So, of course, that's what Jews were taught. But he goes to these Gentiles and he says, you know this as well, right? This is very good knowledge that you guys understand this is the way we think. This is the way we feel. It's not lawful. It's not honorable. But then what? God has shown me that I should not call any man unholy or unclean. And therefore I came without any misgivings. All right? God showed me in that vision of the unclean animals in which he said, no longer consider unclean what I have cleansed. So very much what we're talking about here. All right? Acts 18, 13 through 16. Now we're in the city of Corinth. We're with Paul. And the Jews get Paul, right? They arrest Paul. They attack Paul. And they bring him to the proconsul, the Roman governor Gallio. And here's what they say. This man persuades men to worship God contrary to the law. These are the Jews talking to Gallio. So then what happens? But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, if it were a matter of wrong or a vicious crime, O Jews, it would be reasonable for me to put up with you. But if there are questions about words and names and your own law, well, look after it yourselves. I'm unwilling to be a judge in these matters. So I use this to illustrate, notice the difference, right? The Jews kind of make a mistake here in front of Gallio. Do you see the mistake that they make? What's the charge they bring to Gallio about Paul? Their law. He's preaching things against the Jewish law, right? Now, to a Jew, hey, that's dishonorable, that's wrong. You know, Paul's a Jew, he shouldn't be doing that. But Gallio's a Roman. Does he care about that? No, right? And it's interesting how he sees it. He says, well, if this is about questions about words, names, or even your own law. You know, I kind of get this idea that Romans kind of looked at these Jews and they're always arguing about words and what words mean and names. And, you know, you got Abraham, you got Moses, and they just like to nitpick every little thing and argue about every little thing. So he says, I don't need to listen to that. That's not my job. You have your own rules. You have your own law. Deal with that yourself, right? But if it's matters of wrongdoing or vicious crime under Roman law, well then it's reasonable. Then I will do my job. That's what I'm here for, right? Now, think about Jesus. When the Sanhedrin condemned Jesus, what was the charge? Yeah, and what did they call that? Blasphemy. He's a blasphemer. Now, to a Jew, that's like one of the worst things you can do, is become a blasphemer, blasphemy. And so the Sanhedrin, he's guilty, deserving of death, right? So they condemn Jesus on blasphemy, but then they bring him into Pilate, and what do they say to Pilate? Yeah, not the same charge. Now, they were a little smarter than the Jews in Corinth, right? Because they knew Pilate doesn't care if he blasphemy against their God. They didn't care, right? But what is dishonorable? What is you don't do among the Romans? Yeah, you don't call yourself a king. You don't make someone else to be a king. You have one king, and that's Caesar, right? That's one of those big laws and rules of the Romans, right? You can be a Jew, but don't have any other kings. You don't try to replace the emperor. And so Jesus was condemned by two different charges. And that's why when he went to the cross and that charge was put over his head, it didn't say, here is a blasphemer. It said, here's the King of the Jews. Because that's what Romans would say. That's dishonorable. That's worthy of death, right? And that's exactly the kind of thing we're talking about here. So what did Gallio do? He drove them away from the judgment seat. I don't want to hear these things about Jewish law. So hopefully you can see now, as we know, it was a challenge, right? To be a Jew because of those very things. And we see that. You see that in not only the Bible, but you see that in history. But now, let's take it from the very beginning. At the very beginning, who is it that are becoming Christians? The Jews, right? So now, you're a Jew, but now you become a Christian. And later on, the Gentiles then join the ranks. They're going to have different challenges coming from a Gentile background to becoming a Christian, but you're still going to have some challenges by becoming a Christian, whether you're a Gentile or Jew. We're going to first look at it simply from a standpoint, from a Jewish standpoint to becoming a Christian, right? So you're going to have some of the same challenges that we just talked about in being a Jew, but now you bring dishonor to Judaism, to the group you are what? Part of, right? And what is interesting is that most Jews, even those that became Christians, kept the law of Moses, kept most of the law of Moses, parts of the law of Moses, right? They didn't like sacrifice at the temple, sacrifice animals. There's some other things they didn't do. But they did keep a lot of the law of Moses. But even then, they were seen as teaching against the law. Did Paul keep the law of Moses in part? Yeah, absolutely. Lots of it, right? Vows, kosher laws, the Sabbath a lot of times. But what's the charges against Paul? He preaches against our law, right? That's what they said in Corinth, contrary to our law. So that's an additional challenge, that you're dealing with all the things about Judaism, but now your own people, your own group, are saying you're doing that which is dishonorable. Jesus himself was seen as a blasphemer, as we talked about, by his own people, because he spoke the truth about who he was. All right, Acts 17, verse 6 and 7. Let's go back to Paul. Paul is in the city of Thessalonica, right? And they're upset with Paul, and they go to lay hands on Paul, but they can't find him. So they grab a Christian by the name of Jason and some others, and they bring him to the leaders. And here's what it says: these men who upset the world have come here also, and Jason has welcomed them, and they all act contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there's another king, Jesus. So who are these leaders? Jewish or Greeks? Greeks, right? Romans, right? They are Gentiles because what? The charge is something that, again, there's another king. That's what these men are teaching. And so you can see that's going to be a challenge. As a Christian, you're going to be challenged against the Greek, the Roman culture. You're going to be seen as doing things dishonorable. Okay? But you're also going to be seen as being dishonorable to the Jewish culture. So you're just like, no way to win. You're offending everybody, right? Being a Christian, right? Even if you're a Jewish Christian. So let's talk a little bit about how to acquire honor. How do you acquire honor? Well, here are the primary ways, okay? Just like status, you can be born or adopted into an honorable family. Again, that's probably the easiest way that you can achieve it, right? So you're born into a family that has honor. Honor in some group, more than one group, right? So as a child in that honorable family, what are you going to be taught? What's that? Honorable things. But you're also going to be taught you got to keep the reputation, right? You got to live up to the family reputation, right? This is an honor culture. It's not about you. And so you've got to carry on that family name with honor. You got to keep it up, right? And it's not the same thing, but we talked a few weeks ago about Arch Manning, right? Well, when it comes to football, that name carries honor and status, right? Well, we're seeing if Arch is going to carry that on. Well, he's acting very honorably, very much as a mature young man, even in some of the challenges. I mean, the bar is set so high, almost unreasonably high, right? But that's kind of what we're talking about. Is he going to live up to the family name, the Manning name? All right? Number 2, acting in an honorable way with your group. Doing honorable things. Being, putting that group ahead of yourself. Helping that group achieve something great, right? It's the same in our society, right? You do good things at work and you get honored. You get accolades. You get rewarded, right? You get pulled out and like, here, look, everyone, here is what employee of the year or whatever it might be, right? Number 3, acting good for the group. Now, what's the difference between number 2 and number 3? Well, number 3 can be achieving honor by the group by someone who's not in the group. Someone not in the group, but does good for the group and achieves honor from that particular group. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. Oh, right now. Luke chapter 7, 1 through 7, right? We have a Roman centurion. And he has a slave that is sick, that's very, very precious to him. So this Roman centurion goes to the Jewish people. Can you imagine this? And he asks them to go on his behalf to Jesus, who's a Jew, and asks Jesus to come to his house and to heal his slave. There's no way the Jews are going to do that, right? But they do, don't they? And in fact, when they get to Jesus, what happens? When they had come to Jesus, they earnestly entreated him, saying, he, this Roman centurion, is worthy for you to grant this to him, for he loves our nation, and it was he who built us our synagogue. He's not a Jew. He's a Roman. But what did he do? He did good for the group. He showed them love. He built their synagogue, right? And so in turn, he broke down that barrier wall, even before Jesus broke it down, by doing good for a group he wasn't part of. And so you can see he was honored by them in ways you don't usually see Jews honoring a Gentile. All right, so doing good for a group, even if you're not part of that group. Acting with courage for the group, especially in battle, right? Military leaders showing courage, leading their troops to victory. People showing courage in the military, outside of military, police officers showing courage. That gains honor, right? When I started thinking about this, I was thinking of that NFL football player, Pat Tillman. Remember Pat Tillman? Who had a very promising NFL career, and he gave all that up to join the military, to become a ranger, and to fight the war on terrorism. Now that in itself was honorable in our society. We granted him honor, but then when he died, he got even more honor, right, in doing that. And then when we learned that he died by friendly fire, he still had the honor, but the military wasn't forthright with that because that was dishonorable, right? That would not be looked at. That'd be looked at as a shameful thing. But eventually it came out. And so it's kind of this idea of what we're talking about here, acting with courage for the group. So those are the ways that you would usually gain honor. And of course, it might be different with each group. But look at Acts 18:12-13, back with Gallio. But while Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews with one accord rose up against Paul and brought him before the judgment seat, saying, this man persuades men to worship God contrary to the law. Again, what's going on? They're seeing Paul as being dishonorable, not achieving that honor. And Gallio, of course, what? He's not going to deal with that because it's not about honor in his culture. 2 Kings 5, verse 1. Now again, I know this is Old Testament, but this really does work. Now Naaman, a captain of the army of the king of Aram, was a great man with his master, and highly respected because by him the Lord had given victory to Aram, and the man was a valiant warrior, but he was a leper. So here is Naaman, and what? He's gained honor by his nation, by his king, his master, because what? He's been victorious. He's valiant. He's courageous. And what is interesting, as the author of Kings here writes about him, it's kind of interesting. He was valiant. He was courageous. But who was the one that gave him victory according to this author? The Lord. The Lord gave this Gentile soldier victory. And thus he gained honor in his nation and by his master, the king. All right, so there's a few things we want to talk about, especially next week. We'll talk about what happens when we do the dishonorable thing. Talk about shame. And when you bring shame, what happens? In an honor culture, how do they deal with shameful behavior? And we'll start there next week. As they're coming in, the kids are coming in, let me just really quickly say a couple things. I have some flyers of our gospel meeting coming up, so let's remember that. And there are some black and white copies of that. If you want to take some, we can make some more. I'm also going to try to get some color ones, so feel free to pass those out as well when I have those ready. That's coming up October 3rd through the 5th with Leland Ping. And then the other thing I want to make mention really quickly is keep Daniel in your prayers. The doctor basically is trying to treat the problem without surgery. He doesn't want to have surgery, so let's pray that that is successful, because we know surgery, I mean, his situation is serious. And surgery would make it even more serious. So he's doing well. He's under the surgeon who did the first surgery's care. But let's keep fervent prayers going for him, Mike, and Paula. Thank you.
The first song tonight will be number 378, 378, The Solid Rock. My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest frame, but wholly lean on Jesus' name. On Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. When darkness veils his lovely face, I rest on his unchanging grace. In every high and stormy gale, my anchor holds within the veil. On Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. His oath, his covenant, his blood support me in the whelming flood. When all around my will be number 310, 310.
Good evening. It's great to see everybody. I hope everyone's having a good week so far. Tonight, as by way of invitation, I wanted to jog your memories back to Genesis chapter 6 for just a moment. And in the beginning of Genesis chapter 6, God is overlooking the earth. And while he's looking out upon the earth, what he sees is a mankind, a people, who have violence on their minds continually. That wickedness is so taken root in their hearts that he has decided it's not worth it anymore. Let's wipe them out and start anew with Noah. And that's how it was, that violence was on their minds continually, it says. We find very similar themes throughout the Bible as that. It doesn't get that bad again, right? But we find many other instances in the Bible as we began going through the story of the Bible where violence continues to prevail through the judges, right? We just had a class on that, and there's violence all over the place in the times of the judges. In the times of the kings, murders, backstabs, assassination attempts, all the way into the times of the Babylonian captivity, all the way to times of Jesus. And it might even remind you of Matthew chapter 23 and verse 37, where Jesus is talking to Jerusalem and says, O Jerusalem, you who have killed the prophets and stoned those whom God has sent you. That's the idea, and that's the reputation that the Israelites had in Jerusalem, even up to the point of putting Jesus on the cross and killing an innocent man with the greatest injustice. And I bring all that up to say that the last couple weeks, you've probably seen a lot of news of violence. Between the assassination of the political symbol of Charlie Kirk, a video that is absolutely brutal that has been shared over 2 billion times since the assassination, and 2 billion people have seen. And in that moment, again, it is absolutely evil that murder should happen, regardless of your political leaning, but there were those who rejoiced or even celebrated such acts of violence. How wicked and evil. Or you go to the Ukrainian woman who was sitting on a bus, right? I don't even know, I'm not going to try to pronounce her name, but there was a Ukrainian woman in America sitting on a bus who was brutally stabbed to death for seemingly no reason at all. Or you think down in Dallas, where there was a motel manager who's beheaded in front of his own family by a wicked person. And you just look at all of this wickedness and this violence, and it just seems like darkness is all around you, and it just seems like Satan's right there the entire time. And what I want to point out to you is that's kind of always been that way, right? Since the beginning, Genesis chapter 6, all the way through the story of the Old Testament, to the point where the Israelites even killed the prophets and stoned those that God sent after them. Murder and violence, and Satan has taken the heart of people for a very, very long time. So that's my first point, is that, number one, it seems like darkness is all around you, but I don't know if you know this, maybe you do, but actually this last week in America, church attendance was the highest it has been in years outside of Easter or Christmas. And I think that's absolutely remarkable, that when the news seems to be so dark, right, and there seems to be so much violence put in our faces, and there are people celebrating violence at every turn, and social media has turned into a war field, right? There hasn't seemed to be more divides in America. The response seems to be that more people are going to church. And you ask the question, well, why is that? Did God reveal himself to so many millions of people? Did God reveal himself and come speak to them? I don't think so. I would actually challenge the opposite to you. I think Satan revealed himself more, maybe a little bit further than he normally does, right? He's now in every turn of the news. When you see the mindset of people who can be so wicked and filled up with evil to brutally murder people, and even the responses of it, what you see is darkness in front of you. Satan is there, and he's revealed himself, that he is in the hearts of people now just like he was then. There's a verse in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12, that says, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." And I think over the last 2 weeks, we can say that we've really felt that, right? That it seems like America isn't necessarily in a clash of flesh and blood, but there are principalities and darkness and evil forces that are taking root in the hearts of many people. And that's what we're up against. That's what Christians are up against, right? That we are trying to prevail as a light in the community and the light of America in the churches, to stand up against that present darkness. But it's been that way, right, since Genesis chapter 6. Actually, from before then, when Cain and Abel with the murder there. So if you would turn over to John chapter 1 real quick. I'll have one more verse for you. John chapter 1. And there are 4 words there that I think are pretty important in the Greek. They are skotia, afto, ou, katalaven. And I don't pretend to be a Greek scholar by any means. In fact, the only Greek that I've ever studied was enough to be able to pronounce the Greek. So I can at least do that. It doesn't tell you I know what the words mean, but I know how to pronounce them. And the only chapter of the Bible that I've ever read in Greek is John chapter 1. And the only words of that entire chapter that I remember happen to be these 4 words. But they really stuck with me when I was on a kick to study Greek for, the 3 weeks that I was on a fire to study Greek for. But the 4 words, again, are skotia, if I can pronounce it right, skotia, afto, ou, katalaven. And if you read the first 5 verses with me, I'll point out where they are in just a second. That says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." I think it's interesting, the Greek words that John chooses to use to introduce Jesus to his reader. These words, these 4 words, skotia, which means darkness, afto, which means he or about whom, ou, which just means not in the Greek, and then the last word is the really interesting one, katalaven, which means quite literally to stick your hand in a pool of water and make a fist and pull it back out. And if you think about what happens when you do that, and you stick your hand into a pool of water and try to grab the water and pull it back out, what's going to happen? It's going to slip through the cracks of your fingers. When you open it up, you're going to have nothing in your hand. So what that's saying is that the darkness, of whom this is Jesus here, has reached in to try to grab, and it cannot. It reaches in and tries to grab this light that's coming into the world, which is Jesus, tries to grab it, and when it closes its fist, it comes back with nothing, right? It cannot overcome. It cannot comprehend. It cannot reach out and touch this light, which is Jesus. And those are the words in the Greek that have been there for 2,000 years to describe who we believe in. That we believe even when the darkness seems so thick outside us, and when the news is full of this darkness, and everywhere that we look is full of darkness, we believe in the one that the darkness cannot grasp. When it reaches out to try to grab Jesus, it comes back empty. And I think that's a really powerful 4 words for us to keep in our back pockets as we go throughout our weeks, as we start interacting with people who might be downtrodden about all of the violence and the news. Maybe you're here today because of a reaction to the violence and the news. And I'm telling you, and I'm advertising to you, I don't need to advertise to you about that Satan is real. He's shown that, right? That the evil is very real. But I can tell you that the one that Satan can't touch is the one that for 2,000 years the words have said, when he tries to reach out, he can't grab him. He can't touch you. And if you're close to that light, he can't touch you either. He can't get you. And that's an amazing thing. So we offer an invitation every Wednesday that if you are here and you want to respond to that gospel and to become one of Jesus's and to stand in that light, to flee from all that darkness to the only place where Satan can't get you, we offer that tonight, that you can be baptized. Or if you're here and you're just struggling with all of the news and all of the things going on, hold firm to those 4 words, that your Savior is the one that Satan can't touch, and take that message and run with it. Spread it to everyone, because there is so much division, so much darkness that feels like in the world. How many people could really use that message, that Jesus is the light and Satan can't get him like it feels like he can? So if you have any need this evening, won't you please come forward as we stand and sing this invitation?
Bow with me, please. God and Father, thank you for this wonderful day that you have given us, allowing us to be here together to worship you, serve you, and give you the praise. Father, with all that is happening around this world and all this evilness that's going on, we want to ask you to be with the ones who have lost their loved ones, be with the ones who are struggling with pain, stress, depression, guilt. Be with all who needs you, Lord. Allow us to be your vessel so that we can bring those who are seeking you towards you, closer to you, planting that seed and allowing you to water it so that they can also bear fruit just as we are. Thank you for the lesson that we have heard today by Brother Hayden. Father, while we depart this evening, allow us to drive safe on these wet roads. And throughout this week, allow us to think about you every second of our life, every step we take and every breath we take. Allow us to remember you, think of you, speak about you, share this dark world, your word. Allow the light to shut out the darkness. Be with us the next appointed time. Be with our men and women who are overseas fighting in the war. Watch over them so that they'll be able to come back home the next appointed time. Be with the leaders that we have. Allow them to do what is right according to your eyes, Lord. We appreciate you, we love you, and we cherish you, God. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.